Tiani. Okay, we'll open the floor to comment and questions. All I ask is that you please state your name and your affiliation, and we'll get through as much as we can in the time available. Okay.
Hi, my name is Philip Traceman. My affiliation is, quite frankly, David. He's my brother. But I do have an interest in these issues, and I'm currently employed by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. So we touch on some of these issues. And my comment, if you will, is perhaps to be as bold as to suggest this link that Professor Tiani mentioned between the work, the two aspects of this work. And really what occurred to me from what you were saying is that the link is a flaw in India's strategy going back to the 1960s. And that was really to try and pursue two agendas, which is really the language and the ideas of the non-aligned movement versus India's national interest. And they were speaking at the same time about the concepts of the non-aligned movement versus, or as it stood directly in opposition to their own national interests. Because truly what they were concerned about, or ought to have been concerned about, was what would happen to India. And that seems clear from what you were talking about. And that really comes down to this idea of trying to cast the debate around obligation. The EU, the UK, or I should say the European Common Market at the time, owes some sort of obligation to the non-aligned movement or Commonwealth countries, former colonies, versus the idea of mutual benefits. But the mutual benefit in that case would be between India and the countries that it regarded as being of interest to it. So it seems that the lessons come down to the next point. Don't pursue two agendas at the same time. And what's happening in Europe actually presents India with an opportunity. So rather than disregarding Europe, we have an opportunity to pursue their interests in Europe now, again. And it would be sensible to do that because at some point the non-aligned movement is again going to become unaligned with India's interests. And I'm quite sure India doesn't want to end up being a vassal state of China. So it can be a very awkward position. So my point is really to suggest that perhaps that's where the link lies. And there may be some other interesting aspects to pursue down the debacle that just happened with Barclays, specifically on the Iranian sanctions and funding for the... Anyway.
Well, can I?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a very useful comment because I tried to look at several, to examine several of the Indian strategies. But one of them was to say, okay, if you give us, this trade agreement, if you give us certain concession, this should be extended to other developing countries as well. And I didn't have time to go into this, but there was a general system of preferences that was discussed in UNCTAD. And that was an idea of ambassador land, actually. And so part of this idea was to look after Indian interests. So if the UK joined, there would be a smooth transition from the UK preferences to the EC special preferences for India via the beautiful GSP scheme, you see? That was the idea. But at the same time, this GSP was not just for India, it was for other developing countries, you see? So that was a recurrent strategy also. So thank you, because then I can add this to the paper. I hadn't thought that actually that was also in the paper, but I just wrote it also. Very good. Excellent.
Yeah, that was, I forgot to put this on before. Anyway, that was a very, very nice suggestion. Thank you. Because as you can see, we're literally here mapping out chapter 1, I want to say. But I think the key relationship for India is the US. And last year I gave a paper at one of the conferences here in Melbourne on India and the US strategic relationship with the subtitle, Can Two Wounded Superpowers Help Each Other? Because they both have big flaws, serious flaws. And I think, and what came through in interviews with members of the Indian elite, and also other studies by people in New Zealand and elsewhere about what the Indian elite, meaning decision makers, think about the EU, there is the view that the main role of the EU is to help lobby the US to come to India's side. For India at the moment, India cannot perform the, well, let's call them economic miracles that China has done. The Indian banks can't come, or the Indian government cannot come to the rescue of the US banking system in the way that the Chinese did. It's inconceivable. So, you know, there's no way that India can play that dominant global economic role. Therefore, my argument is the key relationship is India-US, but by India moderated, balancing this diplomacy with the EU coming in as a countervailing source of influence. And that, I think, could have real teeth, maybe not directly in the security area, but certainly in FDI, in what I call critical industries, such as the chemical industry, which is changing and shifting out of Europe into Asia and so on.
Yes, and
Yep.
if I may, that's consistent with the notion that India should be pursuing its own interests, if not directly, I won't say directly with the EU, but certainly through the EU. There is an opportunity there for them to make use of the EU, if you will. And so again, the dual agenda of talking and participating and being part of the ideas of the non-aligned movement versus why on play, doing exactly as you suggest, pursue the US interests, use the EU as a countervailing influence. It just seems to me that that continual pursuit of the two agendas is where, and there's clearly historical evidence that I can't go as far as to say that it generated mistrust or misunderstanding at the time, because perhaps the Europeans weren't too sure as to what it was that the Indian government of the day was seeking to do. So I just think there's a big opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd just also add that it's definitely a avenue to pursue in terms of the negotiation of the free trade agreement. A lot, I'm not sure if the audience is aware, a lot of the Indian negotiating protocols and proposals are actually kept out of public view. So there's lots of speculation happening there. But I definitely say off at this point, they're in the driving seat. They have the rising middle income group that Europe wants access to for their protected industries. And India wants the technology and actual long-term access to Europe. So they can utilize the general predominance of both regions of America to
Well, that's my argument in the industry FDI chapter, that India's calling the shots, not Europe, which is on the skids. But you see, on security, the EU is not a serious security actor because it doesn't have its own foreign policy per se. It has none of its own military capacities and so on. And that means that India is dependent on, ultimately, it's not a member of the US alliance, not like Australian ANZUS, but ultimately, because at least the Indian hawks take the China threat very seriously, and even the moderates in India are not stupid about China. On the military side, the US is the critical partner because it can act. But India is still, however, keeping some domestic capacity going by doing arms trade with Israel and Russia. But even after buying everything it can afford to buy from Israel and Russia, it is security-wise dependent on the US. But yeah, the FTA in agriculture, I believe, is totally dead and will never happen. But in industry, that's our concluding chapter, isn't it?
We'll see. But what I'd like to say is that there's been a big change certainly from the time that I was looking at, where actually it was India, being the suitor in a way of the EC, and today it's actually the reverse.
Exactly. Yes.
Because it's the EU that is asking for certain opportunities in the Indian market.
Yes, and they can't throw away their economic might that they had before.
No. But once I was left with the question, and as you know, David, I wrote the conclusion for the industry FDI chapter yesterday morning. But I'm glad I did. I had an hour in which to do it because David wanted to read it, so I had to do it quickly. But the conclusion I came to, and I'm quite happy with it, is what then will be the economic role of the EU, not only vis-à-vis India, but vis-à-vis everything. Because big industry has no future, actually, in the European Union. It cannot compete with the steel and iron production of China or even India, for that matter, unless it's an expatriate Indian like Mittal who buys into European steel, and the chemical industry is in retreat, pharmaceuticals in retreat. So what's Europe going to be left with? Very important. This will be our concluding chapter, I think, Pascalina, or a part of it. That what the EU has to offer is enormous capacities and in-depth expertise and a deep, deep culture of research, development and technical innovation, which, unlike America, is not totally controlled by the military. I think with the US, it's pointless to talk about the US as a civilian economy. It's a military-industrial complex, and it doesn't work like that in Europe. It's not a military-industrial complex, not to that extent. So I think that will be the chapter at the end.
And I have to say that, so we did some interviews, both of us in Delhi and other places as well. And I went to the EU delegation in Delhi, and I had an interview, I forget his exact title, but it was the person responsible for development of science and technology, cooperation with India. They're doing a lot, it's amazing, and from talking to him I thought that is the future, definitely. The only problem is that the interview is in French, so I will have to translate it or something for you. But anyway, it was very interesting, and I think I'm going to try and definitely agree on that. Yeah.
Because the thing about European technology, just so you realise it's not so vague, in looking at what this EU-India thing is, I discovered that Germany has totally rejected nuclear technology. It's been in the forefront, as Donut knows, of developing wind power. 20% of Germany's industrial energy already comes from solar power. And what's interesting is Indian companies have relocated to Germany to be part of the new green technology. That's what Europe has to offer. Green technology, clean technology, better uses of resources, and even the US to some extent. The US has reduced its oil usage by 15%, and people are seriously now talking about the US itself becoming an exporter of energy. If that should ever happen, India will be the main customer. But that will be very interesting. If the US ever exports energy, it will bring the Indian and US economies into an unparalleled relationship, which may not be so good for world security, I don't think.
Well, it might still suit American interests, I suspect.
Yeah.
Okay, let's open the floor. Yeah, you've got a question?
Yes, thanks. I'm Jackie Pragi. I wanted to just go a little bit deeper into this FTA. Yes, it is true that it's not about agriculture. If you look at the some of the leaked documents on the web on agriculture, the EU is definitely not willing to give much on agriculture. But once 70 to 80% of Indian tariffs on agriculture to come down. At the moment, lentils in India are being grown in Burma. India is becoming a net food importer in certain areas, such as edible oils and lentils, because the investment was in rice and wheat by the government. So going back to this FTA, the free trade agreement between India and the EU, I think there's going to be, the problems with it right now coming from the Indian side, from Indian civil society, because on the one hand you have Indian business, then you have the Indian civil society, then you have the Indian government, which an Indian government's policies on trade, in my view, have been really crazy. You know, so on one hand, protection of private breeders of plant varieties and farmers' rights. Those two don't even sit together, but the laws are evolving that way. The question I have is, on the issue of technology, if you look at the intellectual property rights chapter of this FTA, which has been again leaked on the net, it's crazy. This technology isn't going to come in as a free trade model. It's going to be strongly protected on the EU side. So is there going to be a future for this agreement? Because Prime Minister Manmohan Singh just the other day had to give an assurance to the public that there would be no WTO plus on intellectual property rights in the FTA, because there was such a big hoo-ha around this. So are we going to see a very strong FTA which is going to protect European business interests, because what they're after is the agricultural universities, the pharmaceutical research, where there's, where you can do clinical trials cheaply and stuff like that. But my question is, are you going to see a watered-down version? What's your view? Because this FTA was supposed to have been signed last year sometime, and it still goes on and on and on. Are we going to see possibly a NAFTA kind of agreement, or are we going to see some very watered-down agreement on trade?
Well, Marie, can you help to
Actually,
comment
both.
on this? No, we can all comment on this. Look, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I could say is that the internal decision-making of the EU is extremely slow as well. So there might have been also some problem on the EU side of what exactly is going to be in this agreement. Don't forget that. So it's not just on the Indian side, it's also on the EU side. It takes a long, long time to decide exactly what they want. So if I've seen all these different agreements that I was talking about earlier, each time there is progress from one to the next. So intellectual property right, I don't think it's new. I mean, it was already in the previous agreement, but it's being strengthened as well in this agreement. Which I don't know if it will work. I was in Argentina, I was telling my students, and the FTA with Argentina failed while I was there. So I'm not sure it will actually succeed, but if it does, it will take a long time.
Yeah.
That's all. It always takes a long time.
Now, the FTA between India and the EU, in the chapter on agriculture, I've documented the lobbies, agricultural lobbies against it, and I still have to write that section for India, industry and FDI, but basically the influential business lobbies in India are for the FTA. They're for it. And what's interesting also, I got an interesting insight into this, was when I spent a morning and afternoon with Ashok Gulati, who's the chairman of the Agricultural Crisis Commission, a really good academic, and he spent all of his life working on food and food distribution. And his view kind of agrees with big Indian business and big European business. And the argument is something like this. Oh, and by the way, I don't think you need an FTA for this in any case, because I think what's really driving the relationship is business to business through companies. But his argument, which I agree with because I can't see the flaws, is this. Like Ashok, I've been banging on about the terrible wastage of food in India. 30% of India's agricultural production rots away or is wasted at various stages of the production cycle, which I've looked at: pre-harvest, harvest, post-harvest. 30%. And the example of China, for example, would suggest that the only way you can reduce food wastage of that scale is to develop what in in management is called the supply chain, for which economic historians start rolling their eyes, and the supply chain. But the supply chain is a really critical thing. The linkages between the farmers and the consumers via properly organised marketing systems that can get the food from the time it's harvested to the consumer before it rots. And India has got one of the worst supply chains in the world, even in the developing world, for this sort of thing. And there can be no doubt that the answer to that requires the building of roads and railway lines in India, shops and retail outlets that create those linkages, and the government of India hasn't got the money, no state government has got the money, it's got to be driven by the private sector. And in the end, the argument is that if you can reduce the food wastage of India, you won't have to import lentils and so on. And in all the other major commodities, India is, or has emerged in the last 10 years, as the world's biggest producer of wheat and rice and other things. So on the FTA, which is a slightly different tack, but it's related, because the FTA has to take all that into account. The FTA has to reflect the lie of the land in the EU and in India. The problem with the FTA is nobody knows where it is or what it is. No one's ever seen a single paragraph of the FTA.
No, some of them are leaked and documented, but
Some of them have been leaked.
not the latest.
Yeah, and I know there's one particular NGO in Europe that's closely associated with the Vatican. So I reckon the Vatican leaked it, because the Vatican's got a moral interest in feeding people and so on.
Yeah.
And in fact, the European NGOs have hooked up with the Indian NGOs in fighting what they think is coming out in the FTA. But Ashok has put me in touch with someone on what's called the Working Party. There is a joint working party, EU-India, on the FTA. It is one of my jobs to follow him up and interview him. But it is true that all the civilian lobby groups and also government groups and business groups have complained bitterly that there's been no transparency and therefore no accountability in the development of this FTA. And that lack of transparency is feeding street demonstrations because people don't know what to expect. So if you don't know what to expect, you look at the impact of the 15 FTAs that India has already signed with Singapore, with South Korea, with Thailand, and in most cases those FTAs have decimated small agricultural producers. So that's the problem with the FTA. We're dealing with unknown parameters.
I would hazard a guess though, with the intellectual property. India is likely to push for access to services and investment in Europe because once they are active in the market and domestic competition in India arises, technology transfer is a lot easier. And who actually owns the intellectual property? Well, if Indian companies can acquire stakes, then they have rights to the intellectual property.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
both businesses on both sides have the same.
Exactly. So if they can access the market correctly, and I think that there is that strategic advantage for the Indian government again to push for it. I mean, the one thing Europe certainly struggles with is liquidity. So if they have the money, and don't forget, Indian foreign investment outward has constraints as well. So if you can reform that at the same time, then you can very much get it.
I don't think you need an FTA for that. I agree.
I was about to
Yeah.
say that. This is happening. Who needs the FTA?
Intellectual property is not market enabling.
Yeah, with intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
With intellectual property rights,
Yes.
we're only talking about an area of dispute that pertains to European patents or US patents or any patents outside of India before 2005. Because India had to introduce patent legislation as part of its accession to the WTO. So anything after 2005 is covered anyway. And as one of the commentators that I looked at commented on, India's moving up the food chain, meaning its value-added production is becoming higher and higher, more and more sophisticated, its own domestic technology. In other words, it's actually the interests of India to have IP because it's going to start generating some serious new IP. So that, you know, and the further away you get from 2005, the less important those earlier patents are, with one proviso, which is why in my second chapter I've talked about the argument about pharmaceuticals. Because some European companies tinker with the patent, make a tiny little adjustment, say, oh, this is a new invention. So then they want to take an old patent and register it as a new patent, when in fact the difference is minuscule, maybe less than 2% or 5%. And I was outraged, because we know in the university system that if you republish any one of your articles or chapters and you want it counted as an original article, at least 50% of your content must be new. That applies to academics. But that's the fight that's happening in India at the moment between international companies defining innovation in this ridiculous way, where they tinker with something, usually in order to increase its market attractiveness, rather than its efficacy as a drug. So, but I think India's got that well under control.
Okay, further questions? Yeah.
Just a brief one. Thank you very much, Marika particularly. The issue of nuclear technology. At one stage, if you remember, Saddam Hussein was killed because of his so-called production of weapon of mass destruction. It turned out to be a weapon of mass destruction. And Iran has been accused of trying to produce nuclear weapons too. What is your contention regarding this balancing of power created by the United States of America?
I think it would be wise for me not to answer that question. Because what, you know, as a scholar, I've actually got to go on evidence. So what evidence do I have, right? All I can tell you is that when I was in Iran, visiting various families and so on, one family I came across, one family member was missing, and I said, oh, where's that person? I said, they're a nuclear physicist, they're over there. Oh, when are they coming? Oh, we don't know. Oh, what are they? Well, we don't know. So the problem is, again, yes, it happened also with Saddam. You would have thought that if Iran was not developing weapons technology, why doesn't it just reveal it, knowing what happened last time when Saddam Hussein played that cat and mouse game, pretending to have weapons, because he thought it would act as a shield against US aggression. Wouldn't Iran have learned from that? Of course, you could say, look, it's a matter of national pride. You could also say, well, why should Iran be forced to conform when India hasn't even signed any agreements? And that's where the literature that's been written about how India handled its development of the atomic bomb in a non-threatening manner, if there can be such a thing with a nuclear weapon, is quite an interesting lesson. You think that Iran would learn from the Indian example. So that's about all I can say on that. I really do not know.
Thank you.
We'll take a few more questions because...
I think we have to actually stop.
It's
Because there's food outside.
Oh,
It's been for half an hour.
Oh, okay.
And those have been
Yeah. Food,
because
tea
he
and coffee.
heard signals from there. So I think it's time to move outside. And for the students here, we start again at maybe 5:11. So this is the regular is going to be the lecture.
Yeah, so please join us outside and continue the debate. That's the purpose of all of this. Let me thank you all for attending on a Friday morning, and to thank our two professors for their very insightful presentation.